Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? Fantastic. Thank you for being very talkative right there. Um, so, for this panel, I'm John. I'll be your moderator. I work over at Major League Hacking, which is right across the way with a big, colorful booth. We help early career developers level up their skills and work with companies to find talent, build open source communities, and do developer marketing. In this panel, we're going to be talking about where open source contributors, maintainers, and general citizens come from. There's definitely a sort of perspective here from a lot of different stages of ecosystems and approaches at a corporate level to building those communities and getting people in the door. And so I'm really excited for the panelists we have. We're going to start this off and do a quick intro down the line before we dive into questions. But it should be a pretty interesting talk here. So I'll start with Akersh. Do you want to give a quick intro of yourself and where you're here from?
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's see. I was actually asking my team how I should introduce myself, just given the kind of work we do, and they were like, "Hey, Akersh, just don't be witty, don't be charming, don't be funny, be yourself."
Too late, too witty.
Yeah. And so I was like, okay, well, I will be myself. I have the amazing fortune to support a team of people who are building some of the biggest communities in the world at Meta. And collectively, we empower the thousands of engineers and product people at Meta to really engage in open source at the scale that we do.
Hey everyone, I am Stephen Augustus, head of open source at Cisco. I'm also a maintainer of many things kind of across the cloud native ecosystem, Kubernetes. I've founded a few things. I work together with some of the people on this panel on initiatives that we'll be talking about throughout the panel.
Hello, everyone. I am Demetris Cheatham. I'm the Senior Director for Diversity and Inclusion Strategy at GitHub. I also started an initiative in which I got to partner with the amazing folks on this panel called All In, and they gave us an award this morning, so I'm like really geeked out right now. And so I'm delighted to be here with all of you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. So I always like to start this off with some background context that kind of will inform the rest of this discussion. I'd love to hear from each of you, like, why open source contributors matter at all. You know, you all work for huge companies, you have massive engineering teams. Why invest in open source? You can start in order, or I can call on you.
Well, look at how excited we were all to answer that question. Well, I mean, if you look at, there's this fun XKCD, picture, right, of all of the various dependencies that you think about, and there's like this one little dependency that's like a maintainer in Nebraska or something. I think that open source is at the core of what we all do. If you think you're not using open source software in any way, shape, or form, you're probably wrong. The internet is literally built on it at this point. So it's important to understand the dependencies that you as a person, as a company, as a project depend on and support them overall. So that's why I do it. I get curious seeing software built out in the open, seeing communities built in the open, and helping support that is one of my missions now. So.
Yeah, and I'll take it a little bit differently and talk about it from the context of this program All In that I run, in which it's a program, right? There's tons of programs at companies, but we decided to open source the initiative. And the reason why is when we started on this journey, we were looking at diversity and inclusion and what was being done in the open source ecosystem. Everything was very siloed. Every company, every organization was kind of doing their own thing. They weren't sharing strategies. No one understood best practices. It just wasn't transparent. And quite honestly, we weren't moving the needle. The numbers had been stagnant for so many years. And so I looked at open source and the way we collaborated on code, and I said, if we can collaborate on code, why can't we collaborate on DEI? So that's why the foundation of our program is built on open source. It's an open source community. We partner with so many people and stakeholders in the ecosystem because everybody has a part to play. And I think that's the beauty of open source and why it's so important to us, particularly for All In.
Yeah, I think like there's the collaborative model of open source is really what we're tapping into. I mean, I think, my co-panelists did a great job of like talking about those two extremely fundamental pillars, right? One is like collaboration, and the other one is this idea of interconnection, right? Like look at any commercial operation today, and it's standing on top of a very wide network of open source technologies and the people who shaped them. At Meta too, there's this other idea about open source, is that open source is really a way that we advance the state of the art. It's by sharing thought, by sharing code, by sharing technology. What we're really doing, it's like a rising tide lifts all boats situation, right? So by advancing that state of the art, what we're really doing is advancing everyone collectively.
So I want to dig into that a little more, because I think that's an interesting theme about where that next generation comes from. When you think about open source as a engineering priority in a large organization, right? How do you balance that against product priorities? And how do you balance that with the community management versus typical engineering management involved?
Yeah, I think, so I'll go ahead and take this one because it's actually top of mind. For me, there's one way to look at it is trade-off, certainly, right? Like everything that you do is going to have like a cost and a benefit, but I think that there's another way of looking at it, and that is like the synergy, right? So, oh man, I can't believe I used that like casually. We'll edit that out in post or something. But, there's this idea that when you create a product that you're then open sourcing, what you're actually doing is you're investing in the long-term sustainability of that product. So you are fortifying that product's ability to weather a lot of changes in condition, changes in economics, right? Changes in talent pools, right? And I think like it's, so rather than a trade-off, it's sort of like, how can open source really just add on top of everything?
I think this is a really hard question because for some orgs it's answered. For some business groups within orgs it's answered, and for the rest it's kind of not. So I mean, what I often see is that when a product depends on open source software, and it's really easy to incentivize a product group to help contribute to that community, to sponsor that community. When it's not, the value of arguing, should we contribute to open source versus make money, right? And like that is, it's like it's an argument that just makes me feel icky inside, because I know ultimately it bubbles back up in some way, like on the long tail. But really, I think that if you can find engineering leadership that is, and you can align the open source projects that are ultimately building their product, and say that this is why, like having thought leadership or maintainership in this project will move your needle forward a little bit faster. That has been the easiest sell for me. I think all the other stuff is pretty hard still. So.
Yeah, and I think it's, echoing what you two just said, it's all about understanding that something is bigger than you and bigger than your project. It's bigger than open source, right? Like what we're working on changes the world. I remember when I started All In, and I was talking to different people a lot in the C-suite, engineering leaders, and they were saying, this is an amazing thing that you're doing here. It's never been done before. Aren't you scared that someone's going to take your idea and steal it? And I was like, that would be the best day of my life. Because what that means is that even more people from underrepresented backgrounds are going to get an opportunity in tech. So if I can create something that other people can riff off of and replicate, then that's all the better. That's all the best for both of us. Like, we just had this very fixed mindset around diversity and inclusion that if someone takes my strategy, they're going to go after that limited talent pool that we're all fighting for. That's not who we are in open source. We want to widen the talent pool, as you all just said. And so just a few months ago, I had someone saying, how can we create an all-in for the open science community? How can we create an all-in for the cybersecurity community? That's when I said we're onto something. Now it's open source. Now we're having the effect that we want to have. So copy away as many people as you want to, and I'll give you all the notes and things that you can and should not do. So yeah.
I mean, I love the idea of open source being a vehicle for change, both on an individual level as well as a sort of like industry-wide level. I know all three of you are involved with initiatives that both target, brand new developers as well as very, very senior engineers, architecting complex systems. I'm curious, like, how you've seen open source as like a catalyst for that story. Like, what does that look like in reality when someone gets involved for the first time?
Yeah, I'll start off with this one. I can just tell you that looking at some of the students that we had in our pilot, I said all computer science curriculums at schools aren't created equal. We had people that were juniors in our program that still hadn't taken their first programming one-on-one course. And we introduced them to open source. And we had stories of some of the students saying, we just thought we were going to be able to be project managers or, technical writers or things. And there's nothing wrong with those, nothing at all. That's not what I'm saying. But just giving them access to open source, teaching them a little bit and letting them run with it and partnering with Major League Hacking. Now we had some of those same students that said that they weren't programmers. They were able to take software engineering internships now. They just got full-time offers into early entry software engineers. And I say that open source is the lowest barrier to entry into coding and into programming. And so that's what we look at. If I can get this in the hands and open source in the hands of as many people as possible, whether students or non-students, you don't have to have that 4-year degree. You don't need that professors. We are all of their professors, and so that's what I'm really focused on. That's the lowest barrier into entry, and we got to get more and more people there.
So I think about when Demetris and I started working together. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Inclusive Naming Initiative, and I guess maybe a year and change later, you came to me with the all-in idea, and I was like, yes, now, how, where do I sign up? I am a high school and college dropout. So knowing about programs, like imagining programs that give you the opportunity to learn something that traditionally is supposed to be in school, I think it's just so brilliant. And I think about people who are coming up in Major League Hacking and Outreachy and all these various programs that we have kind of embedded across foundations like the Linux Foundation, giving you this opportunity to partner with mentors within open source communities and build up your resume. How cool is it that you can build a resume in public, right? When normally, I remember when I was looking for jobs, my first 2 books were an MCSE study guide and a CCNA study guide, and I read them cover to cover, and I just had to beg people for the opportunity to work. So knowing that there is a generation coming up behind us that as long as you have internet access, really, right? And even that's something that we have to continue working on, providing opportunities for people to have stable access, right? Just knowing that is a possibility right now is amazing to me, thinking about how I was coming up. So.
Building a resume in public, I'm open sourcing that. You will see that again. Building your resume in public, I love it.
Yeah. The example I always give is we work with students, and most of them have never done open source before.
Right.
And they start off these programs, and they're like, oh yeah, I built a React app once, right? And at the end of the program, they're like, oh, you use React? I wrote code that is in React, right? And I can show it to you. And that is just a fundamental change in how they can present themselves, what they can talk about confidently, how they feel about the world and what they're capable of. And it's just really, really almost eye-opening experience that they have just by landing a pull request. And it could be as simple as a bug fix,
Yeah.
but the fact that like millions of developers out there are using something they wrote is incredible.
Yep.
So my first pull request in Kubernetes was a one-line typo change. Right? So,
But now you have that on your GitHub profile, right? Like, yeah.
exactly.
That's right.
No, that's amazing. I don't think my first pull request even got merged. I think it got rejected, but that's okay. So I'm curious, like when you think about open source, right, and especially as it relates to new developers and that story we're talking about of building your resume in public, building your skills in public, how do you actually leverage that into your own talent ecosystems? And I know not, you folks probably aren't the end user responsible for hiring all of these folks, but you certainly see the impact of it and influence it. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on it.
Yeah. Oh man, where do I begin? Because I think this is like, when I speak to a lot of the people at Meta who have open sourced some of these extremely impactful, highly visible technologies, like we just talked about React, right? Jest, Presto, Vlogs. The first thing I get is, hey, Akersh, like, people have heard about this and they're reaching out to me. Like, they're asking me, how can I be involved? They're asking me if there's a role that works on this technology. So I think, like, that's one of the things that it does, is that it allows people that are driven by curiosity, right, to go find a project that means something to them. And, at the end of the day, if we want to do the best work of our lives, and who here does it, right, we have to do something that means something to us personally. So we find developers that have personal connection with the technology that they're working on, and whether they were moved by, the source code or by someone they were like some inspirational leader, the fact is that they're here because of that. And, and in turn, like the other thing that we see is a lot of these engineers that we recruit through our open source offerings, they're ramped up on the technology. They sometimes they come in and they're just like, they're thought leaders on the subject, right? And so there's a lot of just good stuff that comes out of something like that.
Yeah, so I think I think for the respective companies, we all have like these incredibly diverse talent pools. But to your point, this opportunity to reach out kind of across the world, right, across projects, across geographic boundaries, and be able to source talent that way. There's often people like to talk about corporations doing good. Like there's no such thing as corporate altruism, right? There's something behind it, right? It's a we're trying to make more money, we're trying to build talent out in this space, and this whether it's this project or this geographic region. So I think one, being realistic about it, two, being honest about it externally. If you're building up a community around React, like, there's a reason for it, right? You want to maintain and cultivate an open source project, but you also want to pull in people who have that React expertise and build out a stronger team as a result. So I think it behooves us as corporations, if you are a corporation in the room, to be honest about why you're doing certain things, because people can see right through it. Right, so put your one of my mentors, Joe Beda, he's got a phrase which is like, wear your agenda on your sleeve, right? And when in open source, when you show up, wear your agenda on your sleeve, because it's going to be obvious if you're not. So.
Yeah, and I think that if there's one underlying thing that I'm doing with All In, is I really want companies to take a step back and really rethink what a successful engineer or programmer in their company or in their organization looks like. I honestly think whether it's unconscious bias or conscious bias, there's a profile for what they think the experiences should be for somebody that will be successful in their company. And so what we've created, I call All In the underdog program. Like, we're looking for those folks that are in places that are overlooked, and they are overlooked because life has happened, or they just have different experiences that doesn't translate well on that paper resume. And so I think that that's what we have the obligation and the responsibility and the opportunity to do, is take people that might not have the experiences that are normal or traditional and give them a pathway so that they can have that resume built in public, so that companies and things will look at them a little bit differently. So when we start doing that, that's when we start expanding the talent pool. Expanding the talent pool doesn't mean going to the same historically black college and university or Hispanic serving institution that everybody goes to and recruiting that same top 10% of students that everybody's going at. Actually, that's the fixed mindset version. It's, can you go into places that no one else is looking and actually mine the talent there? And that's why I love boot camps and things like that, where there's not everybody can take that traditional path. Internships are a privilege. I learned that. I learned what it meant for students who lived in rural parts of North Carolina, mind you. And they said that when the pandemic hit, they didn't have internet access at home. So they're graduating now with no experience. And a company could look at that resume and say, oh, you never had an internship and no experience. What I want to do is highlight those students, and then during the semester, use open source to give them that resume that they missed out on during the summer through no fault of their own. It was just their lack of infrastructure and resources that we aren't all privileged to have.
So I think one of the fun things about having, continuing to participate in All In is that when you start to think about like the talent segment of it, the placement segment of it, we were having these conversations about like, what personas are we trying to build for, right? And it's like you build for who's in the room, right? You know, I grew up as, kind of corporate IT, some network engineering, security engineering. There are people who are slanting into kind of the traditional, or the now the more expected full stacky kind of shape, yeah. Right? But there are, I think within those programs, you've got products, project program managers. You've got people who maybe don't want to do the technology portion of it, but they want to map it all together, right? And as I look at open source communities, the places that we're hurting right now are around one, this huge like, how do we build a contributor into maintainer, right? Yep. And then two, how do we sustain those communities long term, right? It's not about landing PRs. It's about understanding like how we pull people into the community, yeah. How do we stay organized, right? Mm-hmm. How do we message that to external communities as well, right? So understanding the personas that you have in the room, especially as you're building out these programs, has been like really, really interesting.
Yeah. There's like two thoughts that I have on this, and one of them, I think that, you were mentioning privilege, right? And I think that even the interview process, absolutely. Right? Your interview skills are, to be exposed to them early, are an enormous privilege, and right, and the advantage that people have in being able to, seek out advice or like coaching is actually not something it's something that often goes overlooked and actually kind of propagates some of these inequities, yeah. Right? And so, I think like that's the other thing about open source is that, how many of you have done like a systems interview or a coding interview, right? Mm-hmm. Someone's like, hey, can you go program the game of life? And you're sitting there just like, that's a serious game, right? And it's with open source though, you've got the chance to look through what someone is contributing on their own time outside of work in a very transparent way. And so you have this opportunity to look at people very holistically. Right. And I think like that is something that's going to help kind of propagate that. And on the other thing too is like what you were saying, I was really thinking about like the diversity of thought too, that like mm-hmm. that open source can bring, because a lot of times we sit in a room and like we're talking about a product, but what happens is if you're talking and consulting with the same people in the same room, what happens? You create an echo chamber and you're not mm-hmm. really able to break that same feedback loop. With open source, you get outside contributors, people talking about something externally, and if you tap into that, you're breaking that very insular pattern of thinking. Right. And that allows you as a company or you as an open source project to disrupt the way that you think. And that ultimately makes you more adaptable, more agile, more competitive. So, What other corporate buzzwords did I miss? I'm just kidding.
You already
You
got
got-
synergy. We should
I
get
got
a
synergy.
bingo
We got-
card
yeah,
with
we-
you.
That's it.
Next time, bingo cards.
But yeah, well, I mean, really important stuff.
Did we do digital transformation yet?
No, not yet.
Is that okay? All right.
John, that,
Next question. Well, yeah.
John, that's you. Yeah.
The digital transformation. No, there's so much stuff there. Like, one of the things that we've seen, and this is kind of really, I think, unique to open source and how it works, is that when you get an internship, someone is investing in teaching you the norms of being like an engineer, right? Like, what does a stand-up look like? How do you get feedback on your code? How do you discuss ideas for how to architect something? But all of that happens, in issues and pull requests too. And it's scary because a lot of that feels like it's over your head, but if you have someone holding your hand through it and like reassuring you, it can be a really accessible on-ramp to learning how to be an engineer. And I think that presents this like enormous opportunity for people, especially if they don't go to like top tier CS programs, Like if you're going, like I went to a SUNY school in New York. It was a fine school, we don't have 100 recruiters beating down our door, but it was fine, and I had a good experience. But like, you don't learn how do you talk to someone from Google, like how do you talk about your code in an intelligent way? And I think that you do learn that through open source. And so programs like All In, Fellowship, Outreachy, like Google Summer of Code, like all of these incredible kind of like open training programs give people that opportunity up front, right? It's really quite unique when you think about how most people get their jobs. Yeah. I'm curious, like, okay, so you talked a little bit about hiring out of open source. It's a brand, a differentiator. It's something that people are attracted to. I'm curious, like, what you think sort of the how you all have ensured that the projects that your companies maintain are accessible and open and welcoming to contributors, because you get the benefits from it, but I'm curious what you do at the beginning of that pipeline.
I mean, I can start. Yeah, this is, there's a lot here, and it'll probably take me a moment to gather my thoughts on this, but I think what comes to me immediately is, community behaviors. And, what sticks out to me always is like, it's not what you say, it's what you tolerate, right? And so, and the purpose of these communities really is to like increase accessibility, like increase diversity, really like, allow open source to be, a mechanism for people connecting in a very authentic way, as we've said before. So, for us, one of the things that we do across Meta Open Source is like our code of conduct. We lay out what we believe are ethical tenets, and we are very serious about those, right? And part of it is like, it has to be equitable, it has to be accessible. We do not tolerate like, bigotry. So I think like, there is like that, the code of conduct and this like ethics and like the tenets that we shape around it, like, and it's actually that code of conduct is, by the way, in every single repository that we have in GitHub. So you'll find it there, and anyone that clones it gets a copy of it. So it's like, that's one thing that we do that's very tangible.
I want to follow up on that before we continue. So I think that's an incredible like place to start, like code of conduct. Open source is this rare instance where internal engineers have public discourse with people outside of the company. What does that training look like to teach people to communicate in a like friendly, welcoming way? Because it's more nuanced than code of conduct, right? It's not outright bigotry, but like open source sometimes has a reputation of being unfriendly just in how people work together.
So yeah, so I think it part of it comes down to, I think I won't curse here, but like the don't be an a-hole, right? And I think if what I try to do sometimes with talking with engineers, sometimes like sales folks, it's helpful like to say everything is a sell, right? Everything that you're doing is a sell, a conversation that you have that might turn into something. Maybe it's not actual profit for your company, right? But maybe it's a lasting connection. Maybe it's a recruiting opportunity for later, what have you, right? Same with open source, right? If you are a maintainer, contributor, what have you, to an open source project, every interaction that you have with someone internal, external, it's a sell. It's a determination of whether, if they're opening an issue, that means they had that issue, right? Is that going to be a blocker for them to consume the project? Who knows? Maybe, probably. They felt the need to open it, right? So I look at issues, PRs, the reviews that go on. Some of it is this person potentially going to be a contributor, right? Is this person potentially going to be a maintainer? How can you cultivate that by providing them a positive interaction, right? So every single thing that you do within an open source repository is a sell, and I think it comes down to, Akersh was talking about the community health files, right? One of the projects that I maintain is called Scorecard from OpenSSF, right? And it allows you to do, I was like, I want to get involved in this because it allows you to do like a check on whether you've got like a contributing.md, you've got a README, you've got where to go for security issues, where to go for the code of conduct questions, right? And so for Cisco repos, for example, and a few of our GitHub organizations, I have that enforced, right? So like if, so it's a scorecard connected with All-Star, and All-Star does policy checks on the GitHub side. If you do not have certain files in your repo, it's either going to open an issue telling you need that file and why, or it's going to, so there's like a .github repo which some of your repos can inherit files from that repo, and if it's missing altogether, it'll get inherited from that .github repo. So there are little things that we try to do to try to steer into correct behavior, but ultimately it is that you need a bit of, like it takes a village, right? So if you're having a conversation with someone, they should be having that conversation with their team. Those teams should be having a conversation with the larger business group, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a bit of it that comes from the top, and there's a bit of it that comes from the bottom.
Yeah. First of all, I'm glad that everybody's using GitHub, or this would be very awkward. So I appreciate that. And I don't even know where to start, because what I've been talking about so far has been All In for students. But there's also another program under All In called All In for maintainers. And we did a maintainers listening tour last year. About 4 months, talked to over 200 maintainers and got so much great feedback on what do they need to see to make more inclusive communities. And you all touched on like 8 pages of this report. So I'm trying to glean it down. I think the thing about creating a welcome environment in your community, there's this tension that we learned about from the maintainers listening tour, is that when you are a maintainer of a smaller community or a community that's just starting, you know that creating that inclusive environment is important, but you're so focused on getting as many contributors to your project as you possibly can. You don't care who they are or where they come from or all those things. And then when we talk to maintainers of those larger communities, they say, you know what? We actually have all the contributors that we need. Now we're ready to start focusing on creating an inclusive community. But by that time, the community is too large for them to influence the culture. So the time in which you need to focus on it is the time in which you have the least amount of time to focus on it. And so then what we started hearing from maintainers is that we got all these resources and checklists and all those things, but every time somebody tells us how to create a more inclusive environment in our community, it's this long, arduous, manual process where we have to just do so much more work. They were like, we're developers. Can't we like create some scripts or some APIs or something for us to automate some of these things? So that's what we're working on at All In for Maintainers, and it's launching in January of this year, so make sure you follow us so that you can get that, where we are actually creating tools and we're paying, not asking for volunteers, but we are paying open source developers to actually help us create some of those tools and user interfaces so that we can make it freely available to all maintainers so that they can do some of those things to create a more inclusive environment. You all were just talking about the conversations that could be happening in your community. Well, we have someone that's developing something that runs a report that kind of flags what could be non-inclusive language or tense conversations that's happening in your community. And we're actually going to train maintainers on intervention and de-escalation so that when you see those things happening, how do you stop them? How do you get the conversation back on discourse? How do you reprimand, enforce the code of conduct, not just have it? So those are things that we're working on All In for maintainers. That's why I said I'm going to stop here because I could go all day about this.
So there is, I just want to point out again, in kind of that scenario, and talking about like the talent placement and all in, you've got all of these, like we keep talking about engineers, but we've got all of these, like once you get to a sufficient size of a community, the lack of the project product program managers, the lack of the community managers, the lack of people who are focusing on like user research and fit, right? Like, is it the right project that we're building? Is it the right community that we're building? If you're not building to have those people in your community, like it's going to fall apart. I can guarantee. And places like I am, I'm one of the, I lead the team for Kubernetes, right? So we release one of the largest open source projects on the internet. And without that level of support in those different roles, like it's not all about engineers. It's actually mostly not about engineers. So.
Yeah, and if we can do a better job of encouraging, welcoming, and celebrating non-coding contributions, then that's when those communities stop falling apart, and we can make it even more attractive for people to actually go and pursue those different pathways. So we're All In for students. We're opening it up to all majors, because I want to test what does it look like for me to take that marketing major or that communications major or that journalism major, politics major, and introduce open source to them to see if they can start filling some of those really critical roles that you're talking about within those communities.
Sorry. Can I barge in here and interrupt everything?
Sure.
Just a moment. Sorry. Is anyone here playing the gamification? Are you participating in the game? Yes. Okay, if so, the code for this session
Do you want me to announce
is
it?
feet, FEAT 10, feet 10.
FEAT10 is the code.
10 is the code.
But-
Sorry, we will edit this out.
But like by talking about the game, did we just lose it? I think
I
we just lost the
game.
game.
Yeah.
I think we just lost the game.
Thanks, Todd.
That's all good, man. Thanks, Todd. Just to piggyback on what y'all were talking about, one of the things I saw, I actually don't remember which organization, was that when they were looking at performance reviews for open source engineers on their team, they actually factored in community feedback as as part of their mentorship perspective, right? Like there's internal mentorship, but then they also looked at external and what people thought of interacting with those maintainers. And I thought that was quite novel and powerful.
But I think it's also knowing that you should be doing that, right? Like the amount of Google perf reviews I've helped write, as a non-Googler have been,
Yeah. So we only have a couple of minutes left here. I always like to end these things with kind of the shameless plug section. I'd love for all of you to just talk a little bit about anything that you're involved with or anything that you want the community to get involved with that you think does, work towards getting new contributors and maintainers involved with open source.
Oh, I have the most obvious. I would do the mic drop at the end.
Have you heard of All In?
Yeah, have you heard of this
Have you
program
heard of
called
All
All In? We are allinopensource.org. Please go there. We started this pilot with 30 students. 24 of the students completed the program, and out of those 24 students, we placed all of them, 100% of them, in internship opportunities this past summer. Many of them have gotten offers
That
to come.
deserves applause.
Many of them got offers to come back next summer for internships, and several of them that were juniors in the program got full-time offers to come back. And so, as entry-level engineers. And so the thing that we wanted to do, we got to expand that work. And so we actually had more open recs than we had students, and we're growing the program by 10x this year. We started with 30, we're doing 300 this year, and we are going to have 5,000 students go through this program within the next 3 years. So we're growing really, really expansively. If you know a student that you want to be a part of this program, send them to allinopensource.org. If you are a company, an organization, an open source community that can host these students for paid internships this summer, let us know. Because one of the things that we learned from students, not all of them wanted to work for companies and large companies. They were like, we want to be entrepreneurs. We want to work with an open source community. We want to work for a startup. We want to work for a nonprofit organization or a government agency. So please, if you have the opportunity to host a student or mentor a student, go to allinopensource.org, and you heard that we're doing some work on the maintainer side, and we need thought leadership and resources available there too. Join the community. Join us at All In. Thank you.
Another shameless plug for All In. I think it's a brilliant program, and for any company that's not involved in a size, shape, independent, like, please reach out to Demetris for sure. On the Cisco side, you should, so opensource.cisco.com is a list of all of the open source projects that we either sponsor, maintain, have created in the past. etni.cisco.com. So the open source program office within Cisco is part of emerging tech and incubations. We are hiring. Check us out. I'm happy to chat afterwards.
And for Meta Open Source, I think our mission continues to be to connect people and bring the world closer together. And at Open Source, it's really about doing it in a diverse and inclusive way. If you want to follow us, like us, and subscribe, we're on all the social channels, as you can imagine. And you could find us at it's opensource.fb.com.
Is there a Facebook page for Facebook, or is that too meta?
There is.
Is that too meta?
And
So I want to do something that I'm not sure that, like, I think we kind of danced around it, but I'm not sure if we, like, got to it, right? The name of the panel was, like, where do open source maintainers come from, and how do we yada, yada, yada. It is our responsibility to create them everywhere. That's hopefully one of the answers.
yeah,
Hopefully.
And I'm sorry, we forgot, all of us collectively, one shameless plug. All In is a pilot year, and even going forward would not have happened, not only with the partnership of our corporate partners, but also organizations like All Things Open and Major League Hacking. The students during the pilot went through a 12-week, 10-hour per week technical project. That's where they developed their skills. Major League Hacking ran that for us. So I want all of you that's in the audience, if you have not partnered with Major League Hacking, you need to be a part of them, because they are amazing and they are doing what we need to do to create an expanded talent pool.
Thank you.
That was my shameless plug.
Yeah, if you want to learn more, we're outside there. We work with tons of companies to help bring new contributors in, teach them how to be successful, and hopefully help them get jobs as well. So it's a really nice engineering and talent pipeline. We work with GitHub All In and Meta Open Source, and maybe, I don't know, Cisco at some point.
I think so. If we
see.
don't, we will be.
We'll
yeah.
figure it out. But
No pressure.
I want to thank all of our panelists, Akersh, Stephen, Demetris. They're all incredible. I think they'll all be around. Some of you have other talks throughout the conference, but give them all a huge round of applause, please.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening in.